Welcome to the very last lecture of this semester, National Public Lands and World Heritage Sites. I want you to take a few minutes to ponder what you're looking at here. First of all, this is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, just a segment of it. I got to take a boat ride out there when I went to Australia and then snorkel and dive for the day and then paid extra money to take a helicopter ride over the Great Barrier Reef, which was one of the most phenomenal things I've ever done. So when we're talking about public lands and World Heritage Sites, there's a distinguishing difference. However, I want to point out that the beauty and aesthetics may be pretty, but there's more to the story about why this is such a significant place. So we're going to kind of conclude this semester with something unique, look at some various aspects to domestic public lands, and then we're going to look at our World Heritage Sites. So our learning objectives are very straightforward. We're going to look at a famous conservationist who kind of changed the face of the United States view of public lands and actually helped get that process started through a conservationist interest group that he developed, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. We're going to look and define various different types of public lands, how they're similar, how they're different. We're going to look at the processes involved of determining the treatment of domestic lands, which is super important to making sure that you are conserving our public lands. We're going to shift gears and look at World Heritage Sites and how they differ from our national public lands. We're going to look at the listing criteria for your World Heritage Sites and what makes them unique, and then we're going to look at a special case study of Leave No Trace. We can't talk about national parks without talking about what led to their development in 1906. So way back when immigrants started to come into North America, one of the first things that you need to think about was, why did people take the risk of moving from overseas to here? What was in it for them? The answer is the potential for the American dream. Get rich, exploit the resources, have plenty of it, not to have to share it with others. In other words, if that sounds selfish, I don't mean it to, but understand these people risk everything to come over here. So very few immigrants came to the United States with the intention of conservation. That was not the purpose. Their intention was to use the land, to own the land, to expand and migrate and inhabit these Americas that we know today. The United States' rise as a world power grew from its availability of very important natural resources, and its influx of people were desperate for work. They wanted something to do. Well, we had plenty for them to do in the United States because we had all these resources that could be taken advantage of. Certain capitalists around the United States took advantage of this and gained unprecedented wealth, wealth that is famous to even a household name as we go through some of these. Then they did it with absolutely nothing when they came over here and made billions of dollars. One of those people would be Andrew Carnegie. This is a steel guy. What I mean by is iron and steel. He came to the Americas, had nothing, and he absolutely wanted to make the railroad system that connects one corner or one side of the United States to the other. This caused a lot of controversy because many public groups became concerned by the overuse of raw materials like rock that contains steel. So I want to take a geology moment here to talk about where steel comes from, because iron is based out of a rock called banded iron formations, known as BIFs, of which were created back when the Earth's atmosphere was first being oxygenated heavily during the early Proterozoic eon of the Precambrian. That happened from stromatolites, which we will show you in a World Heritage Site here in a little bit, and from volcanic outgassing. So that led to basically all the iron dissipating in the oceans and dropping to the bottom of the ocean floor, making these very thick layers of iron. Well, steel comes from iron, and that meant you had to excavate the land. You had to use lots of heat to extract that iron out of the rock. That's exactly what Carnegie did. So, do I think he's a bad guy? Absolutely not. He was doing what he needed to at the time to make a wealth that was unprecedented. You might also think of Rockefeller from the same time frame, two of the most powerful individuals and rich individuals in the United States. And Rockefeller made his riches on oil and gas. So, nevertheless, these industrialists and the business owners had grown essential to the economy and became so powerful in terms of moving politics that no private entity could slow their progress. They basically owned everything. So there had to be a system in place to counter the overuse of the resources that they were using and balance out the negative impacts of over-industrialization, because this represented some of the most important industrialized processes that we had happen in our country. Another thing that had to happen was a mechanism to limit the powers of private industrial developers such as Carnegie and Rockefeller. While they play such an important role in our history, they used the land and continue to use the land until it started to make some impacts. So let's look at a response to industrialization. The only entity powerful enough to regulate large industrial sectors such as Carnegie's steel and Rockefeller's oil and gas would have been the federal government. So the United States government stepped in along with a series of antitrust legislation, for example, the state of California's trust lands, and discussion with conservation specialists. The government slowly began to apply the brakes to over-industrialization, and they've been doing it ever since. One of the key environmentalists who served in this role to assist the process of advocating for the quote-unquote need for conservation was the famous John Muir. And this is Theodore Roosevelt, and one of his famous point at you, like you need to do this. He was often referred to as Theodore Rex Roosevelt because he was tough. He was definitely tough on the industrial world. This man owes a big gratitude for naturalists across the United States. He immigrated from Scotland, John Muir did, and worked at a variety of odd industrial jobs. And if you seem to think that's strange, it is kind of, isn't it? Almost an oxymoron that he's one of our biggest conservationists in the nation, yet he was working in an industrial sector. One of those jobs almost left him blind. So once he left that job, he headed out to California in search of his dream, moved out to the Yosemite area, and he did this right after the Civil War, and he worked as a sheep herder and at a sawmill. His time as a sheep herder would be very important because it would actually help him see the land because he was outdoors. And he fell in love with the outdoors and began to explore what we know as present-day Yosemite National Park and called it, quote-unquote, the University of the Wilderness. John Muir was an adventurist at heart. This is the man that could climb the walls of Yosemite without any rappelling gear. This was the man who studied trees by climbing on them, labeled and identified ecosystems. He was a man of nature. So much so that he has earned the distinguished right to be the legacy on the California State Quarter. For years, Muir fought for preservation of the area in political spectrums where trust-busting politicians were eager to apply conservation for aesthetically pleasing regions throughout the country. In 1890, U.S. Congress would approve Yosemite as the third national park, although the maintenance of the park still remained in the state's hands of California. So as I mentioned, Muir has the honor of being on a state quarter, not a president, but John Muir. That should tell you something about the importance of him to history in America and specifically to the Yosemite area. John Muir became an advocate for all public lands and the benefit of conservation for ecosystems. He established the Sierra Club, which is one of his most famous doings in terms of how he managed to pursue activism in the area of conservation. So this is a special interest group who works to promote conservation, and they still do today. In 1906, Muir persuaded President Roosevelt to lobby Congress and assume federal maintenance from the state of California for Yosemite, and this is called the Yosemite Grant. During this process, Muir also advocated for the Grand Canyon and Sequoia to be designated as public lands such as national parks. This is a famous image of Muir and Roosevelt standing together on overhanging rock in 1903, which is a beautiful scenic area in Yosemite National Park. During the same year that the federal government assumed control of Yosemite National Park back from the state of California, a powerful earthquake struck the San Francisco Bay Area. This earthquake measured an estimated 8.3 on the Richter scale, and it was devastating. I need you to think about what buildings were made of back then. They were predominantly made out of wood. They didn't have electricity, so they burned kerosene. So you put the two together and you have an earthquake like this and fires start to break out. The city's going to burn to the ground. To the end, the fire burned for 3 days and destroyed nearly 500 city blocks. That's a lot of area. So the San Francisco Fire Brigade were overwhelmed, and their pumper trucks could not use the brackish water to put out the fire. And the city's municipal water lines could not provide enough fresh water to adequately fight these fires. With that in mind, put your thinking caps on as a mayor, as a city council, as a state representative, as a congressman or woman, and the President of the United States. How are we going to prevent a city like San Francisco, that was a major port city of its time, booming with growth and population, and it burned to the ground? We didn't have an infrastructure set up to prevent this if should it happen again. So that's going to lead to the next part of the story. Engineers and architects from around the country arrived to help rebuild San Francisco. In doing so, I'm sure they took a few weekend visits to go see the Yosemite Valley area. On the weekends, they would go look at it and then, whoa, well, light goes off. Hey, what if we could turn this into a lake? It could be a reservoir, and we could actually pull water from this area and put out the next fire in San Francisco. So that's basically what would happen. Yosemite Park, or National Park, part of it was considered to be flooded out. Well, this caused a huge uproar, as you can imagine. So after surveying the area, many of the engineers and architects proposed that the solution would be fresh water coming from a dam in the center of Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. So this used to be dry ground. It's no longer dry ground. It is actually a dammed up lake. The site would not displace any residents, and the government already controlled the land. So all we had to do was build the infrastructure, build the dam, right? M.M. O'Shaughnessy proposed to put this dam in place, and of course it got named after him. Kind of ironic, don't you think? So initially this came out to be, and the dam was proposed, and Muir adamantly opposed the idea of the dam. But the great San Francisco earthquake and fire created an array of emotions and the Sierra Club was basically powerless to stop it. Things had to be done for the safety of the people. So how do you balance nature and the people? That's the story here. In 1913, Congress passed the Raker Act, which permitted the construction of this dam. And so this is just a really unbelievable story, because if you've been to Yosemite, you know what the lake looks like. And it's a beautiful lake, but underneath it's even more beautiful land. So when you look at the before and after of Hetch Hetchy Valley, there's some discussion now as maybe they should take down the dam. Maybe they should go ahead and let nature run its course, since we have other means for the city of San Francisco now. So that would change the landscape of Yosemite dramatically. The dam left Muir devastated. Nothing the Sierra Club could do could control this or fight it, because the public outcry for fresh water outweighed what the conservation needs were at the time. Recently, a new restoration movement to deconstruct the dam has gained prominence, though the dam has now been in place for so long that it's altered the natural ecosystem, and to tear it down could cause additional ecological problems. So think about the environmental issues of building a dam, having a dam, and then taking one out. That's a lot to do to a landscape in such a short period of time, in less than 100 or more years. So questions to think about. How would the public respond to building a dam in the Grand Canyon today? Why haven't they? How does each Congress and president redefine the role of public lands? Just think to President Obama and what he did for the national monument in Waco, for the Waco Mammoth site. Could that be in jeopardy with the President Trump? So these are things to think about as you realize that their presidential powers, there are potential for making public lands and taking them away. Are there limits in how a national park could be used to benefit the people? Why are national parks such a liberal idea? Really important to think about. Why is that such a liberal idea? Why aren't we using those lands for making money? Because making money is what the American dream was all about. Well, that brings us into defining public lands. And by the way, this is Yosemite Valley. I just couldn't help but put it in there after talking about Muir. Beautiful, isn't it? And I'll point out this is Half Dome back there, and Hetch Hetchy Valley looks a lot like this, but now it's flooded out. And by the way, this is an excellent U-shaped valley. So at the bottom of Hetch Hetchy, it's filling up with lake sediments, and it is going to be hard to distinguish for future whoever studies geology, and all this history is erased and nobody knows about it, that it really was a glaciated valley. But they're clues for those of you who've had geology that this was a glaciated landscape. That brings us to how did national parks become a reality? The Service Organic Act of 1916 is what made public lands a reality. This occurred from President Woodrow Wilson. As Congress approved additional national parks, it became clear they also needed to unify policy and infrastructure for managing these parks. Makes sense, right? And you also have to have a way to fund it. The worst war in their history loomed in Europe, and Americans became concerned and conscious of their resources. So we're looking at world wars here, and there was restrictions on how much fuel you could use, steel, so forth, those kinds of things. President Woodrow Wilson would sign the Service Organic Act into law in 1916, which created the national park system as we know it today. And it standardized the 40 national parks and monuments that existed at that time. Of course, there are many more today, hundreds more, but those were what were in existence. So this is an excerpt from the actual Service Organic Act, and I promise you, you need to know that the Service Organic Act is congruent to establishing the national park system. I put in red one of the most important parts. Hereby created in the Department of Interior a service to be called the National Park System. Understand that the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States government created this for the Service Organic Act. So you can read on about how the law works and so forth, but this was the actual legislation that prompted the true development of the national park system. So what was the national park system, and why is it such a big deal? It's all about preservation of the land, enjoyment of the people. So that's basically what this sign says right here. It's one of the only places you'll find in the National Park Service that actually has the slogan of the national parks. This sign is actually just north of Mammoth Hot Springs and Yellowstone. So as you're leaving the north part of the park in Yellowstone, you can see the "For the Enjoyment of the People" sign, which is actually part of the act itself. So national parks come in a lot of different forms. Some are big, some are beautiful, some are not so beautiful, but they all have some common traits. So we're going to look at public lands and the different types of them and kind of distinguish how they're similar and how they're different. So let's start with national parks. They're determined and designated by Congress, and they're federally funded. So the funding helps pay the people, it helps deal with the infrastructure, it helps make sure they're protected. Generally, these tend to be large, 20,000 acres or more, but not all of them are. Some of them are really small. Visitors cannot remove anything without a permit from the National Park Service or the Department of the Interior in a national park. For example, in the petrified forest, casual collecting is not allowable for anything, especially not petrified wood, because it's prohibited by law. A couple of national parks that I think are important for you to know about. One of them is the Painted Desert and the Petrified Forest. One, because it's just beautiful, and two, it's an example of when we didn't have really good laws in place, how the amount of petrified wood dwindled rapidly with people taking their souvenirs. Typically, parks are seen as the jewels of the park system and are often referred to as natural wonders, held in common trust, and they're scenic, inspirational, and educational, and I would agree with all of the above. Each park epitomizes a theme and provides the greatest grouping of a specific characteristic or unique feature. For example, the Painted Desert and Petrified Forest are Triassic age sediments in which a massive, large river-type basin was buried under volcanic ash, and these trees were just drowned in silica-rich sediment, and that later allowed them to be petrified. So we basically have a forest locked in geology. It's amazing. So this may not be the most gorgeous place you've seen. It's pretty darn beautiful, though. But it is still necessary to preserve a piece of the Earth's history. Bryce Canyon National Park is located in Utah, and it was established in 1928. It receives up to 1,500,000 visitors a year, and it contains the world's highest concentrations of hoodoo features. Hoodoos are geologic spires that have a cap rock on top, so they're tall with this rock that's hard on top that kind of keeps it from eroding quickly. And these are all made from a long-term process of frost wedging, which kind of breaks apart the Claron formation and helps create these amazing, gorgeous structures. The rim is retreating at about an inch a year, which means ultimately this Claron formation will erode out and there will be no more Bryce Canyon. But probably in our lifetimes, we're safe to go see it. Canyonlands National Park is another treasure located in Utah. It's like the Grand Canyon of Utah, to be exact. It was established as a national park in 1964 and receives up to about 500,000 visitors per year. It was actually founded because of a town nearby that is a high uranium mining town. This is a very remote park. You have to be intentionally going to it just to find it. And it requires about an hour to reach the front gates from Moab, Utah. Great town, by the way, Moab. It contains a number of grabens, which are special faults that have two normal faults where a block falls down. So this is the actual canyon itself, so it's experienced a lot of river or fluvial erosion. And it's one of the 10 least visited parks in the park system. Kind of a neat fact. My personal favorite is Zion National Park. Will win my top prize any day. I think it's the best kept secret of the national park system. It was established in 1919. And its name actually means sanctuary, kind of a fun tidbit. Receives over 3 million visitors per year, and that number is rapidly rising. It's become more and more well known as people visit it and talk about the amazing hikes and the beauty of the sandstone. It's pretty incredible. This particular park encompasses primarily what's called the Navajo Sandstone or Navajo Formation, which is heavily cross-bedded. And cross-beds are formed usually in this type of setting in a desert or aeolian environment. You can form them in rivers, but not with the high angle of deposition that we see on these particular structures. It is truly a remarkable park to go visit. Another park in Utah you might be interested in seeing is Arches. Arches National Park was established in 1971, so a little bit later, and receives about 1 million visitors, and I will say that number is increasing as well. Contains over 2,000 natural geologic arches that are weathered out of the Entrada sandstone, and there's a number of smaller sub-formations that make up the Entrada, and it all is because of differential weathering. It's very similar in composition to Bryce Canyon, and you're wondering, I wonder why hoodoos aren't there. We don't get the frost wedging that happens like we do in Bryce because the elevation's different. So each park has its own unique story to tell, and its geology is always an exceptional, awesome thing. So is the environmental science, and so is the earth science in each of these locations. So it's kind of where all the sciences meet as one, in the biology, because so much is going on in each park it's interesting to understand how the ecosystem relies on what's there. So how do national parks differ from national forests? National forests are like national parks in several ways. Here they are. The government owned, they're conserving natural resources, which would be a forest. They provide for sustainability, and resource extraction is only allowed with a permit. So you can't just go in and take a rock or cut down a tree in a national forest. You have to have a permit to do so. A national forest is not like a national park in a series of ways. So let's look at this. Here's Coconino National Forest, by the way, in Arizona. We visit this on field course in Sedona, and it's a beautiful forest, but it is a national forest, so you can't collect there. Multiple forest uses the multiple use principle. So there are 154 national forests in the United States. They cover over 200 million acres. That's just an astounding thought. What could we be doing with those 200 million acres? Some people say we should be doing something with it to make money, or should we leave it as is in its pristine condition? 83% of the forest in the eastern United States are privately owned, compared to 31% in western United States. So most of the western United States are national forest. 87% of national forests are west of the Mississippi River, and 12% are in Alaska. So when you think about national forests, these are areas that usually are pristine. So there are permits available for lumber and timber, as well as mineral resources. When you think about national grasslands, they're a bit different. There are 20 national grasslands at this time, and they cover over 4 million acres. 17 of those national grasslands are located in the traditional Great Plains prairie, right where the old bison used to roam. So when you look at that, that's right in this area, right in here. Grasslands are essential to a biome, the whole ecosystem of animals and that live in that. And bison are just one example. I can think of prairie birds and various different prairie animals like prairie dogs, a number of other species that have dwindled as humans have populated this area or changed it into agricultural use. So it's not sustaining the population like it used to. National grasslands protect an extremely fragile and threatened ecosystem and are handled similarly to national forests. The national grasslands do permit livestock grazing for some animals, though most areas are designated and designed to counter the overdevelopment of farming and agricultural operations. So why are there so few grasslands remaining? Good question. Let's take a look. Let's look at Nebraska and let's look at Tennessee. And there's part of your answer right there. Two very different ecosystems, and the eastern half of the continent is very highly populated, where the western side and central stuff is not. So when you look at this, the land's different, the ecosystem's different, the biome's different. How are national monuments different from national parks and national forests? First of all, they're approved through the Antiquities Act, which was passed in 1906. And that serves as your primary tool for establishing most of the national monuments around the nation. The federal government protects national monuments much like they do national parks, but it is definitely a much more eclectic process, meaning broad. National monuments are determined by an executive order from the president, not by a congressional mandate. So that is one major way that they're different from a national park. And again, the example in Waco, Texas, of the national monument for the Waco Mammoth site would be a case in point. Generally, national monuments are smaller than national park, but not always. They can be fairly large, and they lack a diversity of attractions. So they're not the same. They're usually just one thing there to look at. And this would be an example of Ventana Arch in El Malapaye that we visit on field course, and it's in New Mexico. National monuments often are intended to preserve at least one significant resource, something special about them. Most national monuments are under the supervision of either the Forest System, the Bureau of Land Management, and even the Department of Agriculture. The Waco Mammoth National Monument is a case in point of being the most recent monument added to Texas, certainly Central Texas. President Barack Obama signed it into law using the Antiquities Act in 1915. What makes it so special is it contains a nursery herd of Columbian mammoths. They were thought to have died thousands of years apart, several thousands years apart, and there's like actually 3 layers. Recently a new discovery was made that there's actually a 3rd layer, but there's 3 different flooding events that have occurred that animals came to this area. And if they're flooding events or drought events, that's the unclear part right now. And the science is changing on that, so more to some. But nevertheless, the area became problematic in becoming a national park or a national monument. So when President Barack Obama signed it into law with the Antiquities Act, that was a big deal because he signed a whole bunch of these into law while he was in office his last year. National battlefields and historic sites. How are they different from the others? These are treated similar to a national park, and they're government owned, and you cannot collect any souvenirs like a bullet casing or something like that, or old, if you see something that might have been a uniform or something that would have been related to that time frame of the specific historic event that occurred in these regions. Each of these sites are linked to specific historical events. And this might be an example, the Shiloh National Military Park in Tennessee. What are national preserves? These are interesting. This is Big Thicket National Preserve in Texas. And this one was first established in 1974. And all national preserves are designed to protect specific resources and very specialized habitats. Sometimes hunting and fishing are permitted, and you have to get a permit from the Department of the Interior in order to do that. But most national preserves that do not offer hunting could qualify for national park status. So a lot of them choose not to do that because they want the national park emblem in order to have more funding and more protection. So what's a wilderness area? These began to be established in 1964, and they're not for the sleight of heart, meaning you've got to be able to be in the backwoods and understand that there's not water, there's not sanitary sewer, there's not those things that we're used to in everyday life, and then of course there is wildlife back there. It's designed because the visitors to national parks disrupts wildlife ecosystem. Unfortunately, we would be an invasive species to these systems if they were naturally in the wild. So these places may require hikers to hold a backcountry permit to do hiking, especially if it's extensive multiple day and night hiking. And they have to demonstrate that the visitors are competent in their outdoor/survival abilities. So this is the Subway and Kolob Canyons in Zion National Wilderness Area. So this would be an example of a wilderness area. No roads, hunting or motors. Wilderness areas are designed to retain the primeval character and influence without permanent improvements of human habitation. You carry in, you carry out, and you leave no trace, literally. Leave no trace. So what comes in goes out, trash and all, poo and all, everything in between. You leave no trace. Often they accompany existing national parks but are difficult to access because of their remoteness, and that's why they're wilderness areas. So what are some other national park family members? There are national lake shores, seashores, memorials, parkways, rivers, scenic trails, national trails. There's a number of these, and all of them are worthwhile places to visit. I would encourage you to get a national park pass each year so you can get into these places and not pay the entrance fee, because after you paid for a couple of them, you bought the $80 pass for the year, and it lets you into all of these places. So encourage you to do that. You can actually go online and buy one, or first time you go to a national park or one of these types locations, purchase one so you can be able to visit the place free. But any kind of camping or permits are extra cost. So when you think about national parks, what kind of questions do you have? Oh, and by the way, this is the best park ever, Zion National Park. It is totally awesome. You've got to go. So what is the function of each method of conservation? How effective is this diverse system of public lands? And what is likely to happen in the future for conservation of these lands? Do you believe there will be more or less acreage of the national park system and forest system in the future? Could our next president change that, or the president thereafter? These are all things to consider as you think and you look at public lands. Now let's move into World Heritage Sites. I'm just enamored by World Heritage Sites because they are the jewels of the world. This is Waterton International Peace Park, so it's all actually called Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. So it's Glacier National Park, and this is actually on the glacier side, not on the International Peace Park side. Is what it's called, and it is beautiful out there, and it is just stunning. And you see that big U-shaped valley, and there's the place where you can stay right there on the glacial lake. These are places that have importance to World Heritage. So what does that really mean? To be included on the World Heritage List, a site must be of outstanding universal value, not just local value to a nation. And they must meet at least one criteria for being selected. There are 10 criteria, which some of them have nothing to do with nature. Several criteria apply to public lands. Natural beauty. Obviously, the last picture was natural beauty. Human interaction with environmental change. Glacier would be an example of that. Represents major stages of the Earth's geologic history, for example, the Grand Canyon. Significant biological or ecological process and evolution. So something about the development of species and being able to maintain that in some special, very specialized habitat for biodiversity. Let me give you a few examples that are not nature related. Some piece of really great architecture, like the Sydney Opera House. Could be some kind of cultural site that is designated for a very specific purpose. So it's not always about nature and beauty. It's about everything. So there are 10 criteria, but these are the 5 that deal with nature, and nature wins the prize in terms of having the most criteria on the list. When you're looking at how to designate a World Heritage Site, the first one is a cultural site. And you can see over here, they're designated in yellow. And then you can see natural sites, they are in green. And then mixed sites have yellow and green. And so sites denoted in a red color are in danger of the characteristic that put them on the list. In other words, something's going haywire in that department. So maybe the cultural is being demolished, or maybe environmental change is impacting a specific national park. Maybe the reason that they're being listed is kind of fallen by the wayside. So it's earned additional attention to trying to be maintained and preserved if it's at risk. And like an example in the United States would be the Everglades. As the Everglades continue to diminish and we have invasive species there, so that would be a good example of one that's actually having issues with being on a red color, in other words, being in danger. So here's the basic modern list, the current list, and this is subject to change in a few years, but you look at the United States and you see a lot of green, you see some yellows, but you don't see a lot of mixed. And I want you just to kind of focus around the world and notice that they're everywhere. So these are really important places that have been designated as World Heritage Sites. So these are places that you definitely do not want to collect anything from, because it would be an international issue, not just a domestic issue. So be careful when you're traveling abroad. Several globally listed noteworthy sites that I've been to, that besides Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, would be the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. This is a site designated for its rare beauty, its habitat, biodiversity, and it's truly remarkable. It's not been around forever, so historically speaking, from a geological perspective, it's young, but it has established some remarkable coral reefs, and they're all types of corals, not just barrier reefs there. I want you to know that it has every type of coral available. It's just in a barrier reef system. Then there's Shark Bay, which is in Western Australia, and it's the site designated for its stromatolites. There are only 2 places in the world that have large colonies of living stromatolites. And stromatolites contributed to the formation of the Earth's atmosphere back in the Proterozoic eon of the Precambrian. And this particular area is also very special because it has a set of unique mammals that are marine. And so its biodiversity and habitat is preserved. And these are stromatolites. They're very, very shallow water. It's very salty and a special place to visit indeed. It's in Western Australia. So going back one, it's going to be this site right here. That's it right there, just to kind of give you flavor. So very awesome, beautiful places. So where are the World Heritage Sites in the United States? There are 23 of them in the United States, including some famous national parks. So here they are. The Grand Canyon, and obviously that's world history and beauty. Yellowstone National Park for its remarkable ecosystem and geologic features such as geysers. Yosemite National Park, no brainer there. Everglades National Park, and it's the one that's in red. That's kind of an important test question because it is in decline. The Redwood National and State Forest, there are both there in when you go to the state of Northern California and Southern Oregon, you can see the Redwood National and State Forest. It's really pretty spectacular. Olympic National, which is really everything right above Seattle in the state of Washington State. Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, and Carlsbad Caverns National Park. I am happy to say that I've been to all of these places and would go to any of them again. So let's look at a final case study of Leave No Trace. And you might have already heard this story, but it kind of epitomizes why we're looking at public lands and World Heritage Sites. We want to restore beauty and we want to keep that beauty there long term, even if it's in your own backyard. That's something to think about. Public lands, while they're good, what about the rest of the land? Shouldn't we have been protecting that all along? Well, again, I'm going to have to say there's a balance between human need and the environment. So let's look at Leave No Trace. And if you're not familiar with Leave No Trace, that is actually a trademark organization that has standards for living in the outdoors, for participating in outdoor events like hiking and wilderness backcountry stuff. It's a very famous organization for conservationists. In 2014, Miss Casey Knockett participated in a series of road trips in the American West. She worked as a self-proclaimed artist, hoping to boost her social media followings on Tumblr and Instagram with amazing pictures of her art. Let's be clear, it is graffiti. So her handle, @creepytings, served as the resounding focus of her art. However, the problem with her art was not the message, it was the canvas. She was painting on protected rocks. So as a geologist, I'm floored by that, and I'm floored that she intentionally did it in multiple places. You may not feel the same way, and that's okay, but I'm going to have to say the moral compass issue comes to play here. These are some of the images that she left in some of the most famous national parks out west. A couple just to name out there. Yosemite, Zion, just to name a handful. And she did this in like 7 different places, so there was a number of places that she decided to leave her art behind for people to see. This is her actually filming and photographing herself doing the actual work, and she did it with permanent paints, so it wasn't like it was in chalk. Even then, it's still illegal to deface or damage rock formations, according to PERPA, and that's the Paleontological Resource Preservation Act. So she got caught on camera and did it intentionally. So she posted public images of her art across America to her Instagram and Tumblr pages, where other users spotted and reported the vandalisms to authorities. Knockett was charged with 7 counts of vandalism and sentenced to 200 community hours, a fine, and prohibition from all public lands for 2 years. And that's 20% of all the United States. Let's take a look at her story.
Tonight, a California woman is admitted to vandalizing national parks with these paintings on rock formations. 2 of them were here in Utah. Today, a judge banned her from public lands.
Fox 13's Zach Whitney joins us in studio tonight with details on her sentencing. Zach.
That's right. Today, Casey Knockett pleaded guilty to 7 misdemeanor counts of damaging government property. In 2014, she visited 7 national parks and defaced rock formations. Now she'll spend a long time doing community service in those parks.
Graffiti in a park is vandalism. It's not art. It is just something that takes away from what we're here to preserve and protect, kind of why people come here.
Self-proclaimed artist Casey Knockett will spend 200 hours of community service cleaning national parks after she pleaded guilty to drawing these doodles on rock formations in 7 parks, including Canyonlands and Zion. According to court documents, Knockett drew on the rock formations with permanent marker and acrylic paint, then posted it on social media. At the time, artists visiting Zion told Fox 13 they were shocked someone would permanently deface the rocks.
I could understand people doing that if it weren't permanent, I guess. You know, you could do it and then it washes away in the rain, but because she used acrylic paint and it was permanent, I don't think that's that cool.
In addition to community service, a California judge banned Nakib from entering land administered by the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Army Corps of Engineers for 2 years. The Zion National Park spokesperson says they work very hard to keep vandalism from happening.
Removing it itself actually does damage the resources. You know, it can chip rocks. Also, you know, if it
So that was just the basic news cast for just Zion alone. That doesn't include the other 6 places that Casey Knockett visited. So there are a number of case studies I could show you, some that are more recent than Casey Knockett's, that are just absolutely astounding, devastating for public lands. Now, let's do a little bit of science servings to kind of end the lecture with something important. There are 412 public lands covering over 80 million acres in every state and territory of the United States of America. In 1891, the Shoshone National Forest was introduced as the first national park near Yellowstone National Park. The U.S. National Park Passport provides the cost-effective way to do and see the places and get a souvenir because you can stamp your book, but I encourage you to get the pass, get the park pass so you can get into these places. More than 300 million people annually visit United States national parks, and as you visit some of these, you're going to realize it's not just Americans. People from all over the world travels to see these jewels that we have here. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park represents the most visited national park in the country with over 9 million visitors annually. That blew me away because I realized it wasn't the Grand Canyon. And I was almost sure it had to be the Grand Canyon or Yosemite. But when I found that out, I was like, wow. And then it made sense because we got so much population in the eastern side of the continent. Kobuk Valley is the least visited, just several thousand people annually, and has no roads anywhere in the park. So it's kind of an interesting thing of how diverse an array these places are. The largest national park is Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve with over 13,200,000 acres. The smallest national site is the National Memorial shown right here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Congress approved the Yellowstone Act in 1872 and established the first national park, but it remained unsure of the best way to manage the area. Kind of interesting, isn't it? The U.S. Cavalry served as the park's caretakers for a long time, and approved hunting was allowed within the park boundaries. That's why, like, if you go to Yellowstone, especially in Mammoth Hot Springs, there's still barracks there for the military that used to oversee the park. When we look at the Antiquities Act of 1906, this is where the president has the ability to claim something for public use or public lands. And it also states that any person shall appropriate, excavate, injure, or destroy any historic or prehistoric ruin or monument or any object of antiquity situated on lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States without the permission of the Secretary of the Department of the Government having jurisdiction over the lands on which said antiquities are situated, shall, upon conviction, be fined in a sum of no more than $500 or be imprisoned for a period of no more than 90 days or shall suffer both fine and imprisonment in the discretion of the court. This is a fairly antiquated law, no pun intended, for the Antiquities Act, but it's still utilized today, primarily in the way of designating public lands. thinking about what that video just showed kind of gives me goosebumps because it's what's ingrained in my soul and my heart. And I hope that as you have watched this, that you've learned a little bit this semester about the world, the earth, its history, about the environment, understanding that we're all in it together and this is our home and we need to protect it. Not just our public lands, not just World Heritage Sites, but right where we live in our own backyards. So consider that every day when you're doing your daily routine. Think about the trash that's on the side of the road. Think about your impact to the environment and what you can do to help reduce it. Because this Earth is the only one we've got, unless you plan on moving to somewhere like Mars, and that might be a while or an expensive ticket. It's been an honor to serve you and to teach you this semester, and I am greatly looking forward to seeing you in a future class. Thanks. Bye.